Why do human beings believe in things they cannot see, touch, or prove? Why do people throughout history and across cultures cling to religious convictions, even when they defy logic or invite suffering? William James, the pioneering psychologist and philosopher, believed this was not a sign of weakness, but a profound window into the nature of human consciousness. In religious belief, James saw the deep structure of the psyche exposed. Religious experiences are not irrational, he argued. They are intensely personal responses to real conditions of existence: finitude, suffering, mystery, longing. James did not ask whether religion was true in any final, dogmatic sense. Instead, he asked what it does, how it functions in a person's inner life, what effects it has on behavior, on hope, on resilience. For him, the pragmatic value of a belief, its power to sustain, to guide, to transform, was inseparable from its meaning. This video draws exclusively from the Varieties of Religious Experience and other original writings by William James. We will explore how belief arises not from argument, but from temperament and experience. How faith is not an escape from reality, but a way of engaging with its deepest layers. You will discover why James defended the right to believe without proof, and how religious faith, even when unverifiable, can be ethically and psychologically justified. Stay until the end. If you've ever questioned your faith or wondered why, belief persists even in the absence of certainty. William James offers not certainty, but something more valuable, a way to understand the sacred as a dimension of experience, one that begins, not in doctrine, but in the depths of the self. Woman sits in the back pew of an empty church. The late afternoon sun filters through stained glass, casting colored fragments across her hands. She is not praying, not exactly. She is remembering a funeral, a betrayal, a moment of peace years ago. The silence is thick, not with absence, but with presence. Something hovers. She cannot name it, but she feels it. William James would recognize this moment. For him, religion is not what happens in doctrine, it is what happens in silence. In the immediate felt experience of the unseen. James's masterpiece, The Varieties of Religious Experience, does not begin with theology. It begins with the individual. Not the saint, not the prophet, but the ordinary person confronting existence. He believed that religious belief is not primarily an intellectual conclusion. It is a psychological event. It arises from temperament, from emotional needs, from moral imagination. And it becomes real not because it is logically airtight, but because it is lived. To understand this, James developed a radical psychological insight. Beliefs are not static ideas. They are tools for navigating reality. He asked not whether a belief is objectively true in a metaphysical sense, but whether it is subjectively true. Does it help you live? Does it enable courage? Does it bear you through suffering? If a belief makes life more livable, more meaningful, more morally intense, then it has, in James's words, cash value. It is verified in the currency of experience. This pragmatic approach does not reduce religion to utility. On the contrary, it honors the depth of belief by refusing to sever it from the life it sustains. James saw that religious experiences, conversion, ecstasy, despair, renewal, are not marginal. They are central. They reveal the inner architecture of the human psyche. In moments of religious intensity, people often report a unifying insight, a sense of connection, a clarity that transcends language. These are not delusions, James insisted. They are data. They show us what consciousness is capable of. He spoke of the sick soul, the person who cannot simply affirm the world, who feels its weight, its contradiction, its brokenness. For such a person, religion is not comfort, it is necessity. It is a response to a wound. And that response is not always rational. It is existential. The religious consciousness is shaped not by argument, but by experience, by crisis, by awe, by the refusal to accept that this world is all there is. And yet, James was no mystic apologist. He made a sharp distinction between the institutional and the personal. Organized religion, he warned, often distorts the purity of religious feeling. It turns living experience into dead doctrine. It replaces inward passion with outward conformity. True religion, for James, is felt. It is immediate. It is often solitary. It occurs in the stillness of the heart, in the moral struggle, in the depths of the self. This is why he placed so much emphasis on religious temperament. Some people, by nature, feel the sacred more vividly. They are sensitive to mystery, to suffering, to the infinite. Others live in what he called the once-born condition, comfortable, content, morally upright without inner division. But the twice-born, those who have faced despair, who have died inwardly and been reborn, these are the ones who live religion existentially. Their faith is not a shield. It is a scar that glows. And here James makes his most controversial move. He argues that even without empirical evidence, even without rational proof, the individual has the right to believe. This is the core of the will to believe. When a belief is a live option, that is, emotionally compelling, morally urgent, existentially significant, we may choose it even without full knowledge. Because the decision to wait for certainty may close the door to a kind of truth that only opens through trust. Faith, in this sense, is not irrational. It is pre-rational. It is the condition for discovering a truth that would otherwise remain inaccessible. This is not wishful thinking. It is a recognition of how life actually works. We fall in love, we take jobs, we raise children, we fight for justice, rarely with perfect certainty. We act in hope, in commitment, in belief. And religion, for James, is simply another domain where this existential logic applies. To demand certainty before belief is, in some cases, to prevent belief from ever forming. And in doing so, we may miss the very transformation that belief could produce. So the woman in the pew is not a theologian. She is a witness, not to dogma, but to experience. Something in her fragile, unresolved, quietly persistent, reaches for meaning. And in that reaching, she enacts what James called the moral experience of religion, a sense of connection, of significance, of being seen. If you felt that, if you've stood on the edge of the visible world and sensed something more, then this journey is yours. Stay with us, subscribe, and join the exploration. Because what we believe and why we believe it may be the most important questions of all. A man finds himself on a hospital bed, the fluorescent lights above him humming softly. He has just been told the diagnosis. It is not terminal, but it is serious. He nods, thanks the doctor, and stares at the ceiling. In that moment, time slows. His body feels foreign. His thoughts scatter. But amidst the confusion, a quiet question rises. What do I believe in now? William James would say that such moments, raw, unscripted, irreversible, are where the psychology of religious belief reveals itself most clearly. Not in catechisms or creeds, but in the silent cry for meaning. When the structures of ordinary life begin to crack. For James, religion is not a luxury. It is a response to crisis, to uncertainty, to the unavoidable facts of mortality, guilt, loneliness, and awe. James was not a theologian. He did not attempt to prove the existence of God, nor did he dismiss God as illusion. He approached religion from the inside, from the perspective of experience. He wanted to know what it feels like to believe, what it costs, what it changes. He argued that religious beliefs are not abstract propositions, but concrete attitudes toward life. They are ways of relating to the universe, to suffering, to death. They are orientations of the will. This is why he resisted the reduction of religion to either superstition or mere social convention. For James, belief is a lived phenomenon. A person believes not because they have compiled arguments, but because they have lived into a certain vision of the world. A vision that often emerges from rupture. The man in the hospital bed is not asking for metaphysical proofs. He is asking whether life still has shape, whether there is something deeper than fear, whether he is still held by love, by memory, by mystery. James understood that religious belief is as much about temperament as about evidence. Some people are constitutionally predisposed to faith, others to skepticism. But even the skeptic, when pressed by life, may find themselves reaching beyond reason. And when they do, they are not betraying intellect, they are expressing a deeper truth. The truth that human beings are not just thinkers. We are feelers, choosers, actors. Our beliefs must resonate with the whole of us, not just the logical, but the existential. This is why James defended the right to believe even in the absence of proof. He recognized that we often act on trust, on feeling, on the sense that a certain path, though uncertain, is right. In the will to believe, he insists that religious belief can be justified pragmatically by its fruits. If believing in a loving God makes a person more generous, more forgiving, more courageous, then the belief has value. And that value is not invalidated by lack of empirical certainty. Of course, James never claimed that all religious beliefs are beneficial. He distinguished sharply between the healthy-minded and the sick soul. The former sees the world through optimism, through joy. The latter sees it through brokenness, through the experience of evil. Both have their place, he said. But the sick soul, who cannot ignore pain, who feels the weight of sin and loss, is more open to religious transformation. They do not seek faith as decoration. They seek it as rescue, and when rescue comes, when the burden lifts, when the heart expands, something changes. James called it conversion, not always dramatic, sometimes quiet, but always decisive, a shift in the center of gravity, a new orientation of life. The person who undergoes it is not simply adopting a new belief. They are becoming someone else. Not a stranger, but a truer version of themselves. Someone who now sees the world as infused with moral significance, as spiritually alive. This transformation, James argued, is not illusory. It is real. It is verified by conduct, by character, by the ability to endure. A religious belief is vindicated not by argument, but by the kind of life it enables. And if that life is fuller, deeper, more integrated, then the belief has done its work. It has touched the self at the deepest level. It has become part of what James called the total reaction upon life. So the man in the hospital bed is not alone. He is, in that moment, part of the great human drama that James devoted his life to understanding. The drama of belief, of risk, of transformation. He may not find a definitive answer, but he may find something else, a sense that he is not forsaken, that his life, though fragile, is meaningful, that he is, somehow, known. A young man steps into a forest clearing just before dawn. The trees stretch upward like silent witnesses. The air is thick with mist. He kneels not to anyone, not for anyone, but simply because something in him needs to lower itself. He is not reciting words. He is not following a ritual. He is listening. Not with ears, but with being. William James would call this a moment of ontological reverence, a personal, immediate, unmediated contact with the unseen. James was always more interested in these private religious experiences than an institutional religion. For him, religion was not primarily a system of belief, it was a quality of consciousness. A sense of the sacred that permeates certain moments, infuses certain acts, and reorients the self. These moments are often brief, but they leave a residue. A sense that life is more than matter. That meaning is more than utility. That something real exists beyond the empirical. This sense, James insisted, is psychologically significant. It reveals not just something about the world, but about us, about the way our consciousness reaches, strains, yearns. He saw that religious experience often arises not from certainty, but from need. It is the soul's response to its own incompleteness. A cry for contact, for coherence, for moral grounding. And this cry, when met with something call it presence, insight, stillness, produces what he called the fruits of religion: peace, transformation, moral energy. These fruits are the heart of James's pragmatic evaluation of religious belief. He was not concerned with orthodoxy. He did not ask, "Is this doctrine true?" He asked, "What does this experience produce? Does it make the person more integrated, more compassionate, more resilient, more attuned to the moral dimension of life? If so, then it is real, at least as real as any scientific observation. Because it changes how life is lived. This is a bold move." James treats subjective experience not as suspect, but as valid. He refuses to separate psychology from philosophy, feeling from knowing. The self, in his view, is not a machine processing data, it is a living moral agent navigating mystery. And religion, for many, is how that navigation takes place. But how? Does it work? James identified several common traits of religious experience. A sense of ineffability, it cannot be fully described. A noetic quality. It conveys insight, transiency. It passes quickly. And passivity, it feels like something is happening to you. These traits are consistent across cultures, across faiths. Whether in a Christian monastery, a Sufi trance, or a solitary walk in nature, the core feeling is similar. A sense of being touched by something greater, something intimate, something absolute. James did not interpret these experiences theologically. He interpreted them psychologically. He saw them as openings, portals through which a person encounters their own depth. And in that depth, they may find not answers, but orientation. Not dogma, but direction. The religious experience in his model is not the end of inquiry, it is the beginning of commitment. Commitment to what? Not to a particular creed, but to a way of being. A way of acting in the world that reflects the seriousness of that moment. A person who has had a profound experience of the sacred does not return to life unchanged. They carry a new sense of responsibility, a new tenderness, a new resolve. And it is this aftermath, this moral consequence, that James sees as the true measure of religious value. Of course, not all experiences lead to growth. Some distort, some deceive. James was careful to distinguish between healthy religion and its pathological forms. He warned against fanaticism, rigidity, the closing of the mind. True religion for him always enlarges. It makes room for complexity, for contradiction, for humility. It does not demand certainty. It teaches endurance. So the young man in the fosse or the young man in the clearing does not leave with answers. He leaves with something else, a changed inner climate. He walks back into his life with quieter steps, with a slower heart, with a deeper gaze. He does not know what touched him, but he knows he was touched. And in James's view, that is enough. The experience has done its work. It has moved the center of gravity. It has called forth a self that is more awake, more attuned, more alive. Mother watches her sleeping child and feels a sudden wave of vulnerability. not just her own, but the world's. She senses the fragility of everything: love, time, breath. And yet, she does not recoil. She leans in. She places her hand on the child's chest, not to protect, but to remember. William James would call this a moment of existential clarity, a point at which the veil lifts, and one feels the sacredness not beyond life, but within it. James taught that religion, in its deepest form, is not about escaping the world. It is about facing it, facing its beauty and its terror, its joy and its injustice. Religion, at its best, is not a retreat into metaphysical fantasy, it is a heightened mode of engagement. It sharpens our attention. It deepens our emotions. It places our daily actions into a wider frame, one charged with significance. And it does this not by offering guarantees, but by inviting reverence. He was fascinated by how religious individuals experience the world as morally thick. Every act, every encounter, every inner state feels weighty, not in a burdensome sense, but in a meaningful one. Life is no longer trivial, it is lit from within. And with that light comes responsibility. To live not as an accident, but as a calling. To respond not with avoidance, but with presence. Yet James also saw the danger of false clarity. Religion, like any human expression, can be co-opted by fear. It can harden into dogma. It can serve ego rather than soul. That is why he emphasized the importance of fruits. The test of a religious life is not belief, it is conduct. It is not fervor, it is transformation. Does your faith make you more human, more merciful, more courageous? If not, it may be belief in name only. And this brings us to one of James's most provocative insights. We cannot separate religious belief from personal temperament. For him, the question, "What do you believe?" is inseparable from what kind of person are you becoming? Belief is not just cognitive assent, it is an expression of the self, a mirror of one's fears, hopes, longings. This is why the same religious idea can elevate one person and oppress another. It depends on how it is lived. It depends on the soul that receives it. James's vision is radically interior. He does not point to scripture or tradition to validate religion. He points to the individual, to their sincerity, to their suffering, to their willingness to change. In this, he gives us a profound ethical challenge, to look not at what others profess, but at what they embody. To ask not what God they name, but what virtues they practice. And yet, this is not a call to suspicion. It is a call to discernment. James urges us to listen more carefully to our own experiences, to the quiet voices within, to the moments that shake us awake. Because it is in those moments, often brief and unrepeatable, that something real occurs. A shift, a new orientation, a taste of what he called a more eternal kind of truth. But how do we know if we're being honest in our faith? How do we distinguish genuine spiritual insight from psychological projection? James does not give U.S. formulas. He gives us a question we must return to again and again. Does this belief make me more capable of living with depth, with truth, with love? This question is not answered once. It is answered in how we speak to our children, in how we handle anger, in whether we take the risk to forgive, in whether we can live with uncertainty without becoming rigid. James believed that religion, when real, teaches us not what to think, but how to live. So the mother sits a little longer, her hand still on her child's chest. She does not know what the future holds, but she knows she must meet it not with dogma, but with depth. Not with answers, but with attention. And in that posture, she becomes not just a parent, but a practitioner of the sacred. And now you too must ask yourself, what beliefs are shaping the person you are becoming? A man stands at the edge of a cliff, the ocean raging beneath him. They Wind cuts across his face, and the sky is layered with storm and light. He is not thinking about theology, that he is not debating metaphysics. He is asking a silent, trembling question. What am I to this universe, and what is it to me? William James would say that this is not a question of doctrine, it is a question of being. A religious question, whether or not it uses religious language. James knew that religious belief is not always born in serenity. Often, it emerges from confrontation with mortality, with failure, with the limits of reason. He understood that to believe in God or in any transcendent reality is not simply to affirm a proposition. It is to stake oneself in a moral vision of the universe, a vision in which the personal matters, in which suffering is not wasted, in which striving has value even in defeat. This kind of belief, James argued, is transformative. It is not ornamental. It is operational. When a person believes that their life is infused with moral significance, when they believe that love, justice, and sacrifice are not illusions but ultimate truths, their conduct changes, their tone changes, their sense of what is possible changes. They do not escape the world, they engage it more fully. This is the key to James's pragmatism. He measures truth not by abstract consistency, but by lived effect. If a belief brings coherence to life, if it produces energies of character, if it helps a person integrate their experience and act with courage, then it holds truth as function, as force, as fruit. And this is especially true of religious beliefs, which often function as emotional and ethical anchors in times of crisis. But James was not naive. He knew that not all beliefs heal, some imprison, some distort. That is why he returned again and again to the idea of moral fruits. The measure of any faith, he insisted, is what it does to the person who holds it. Does it make them more generous, more just, more attuned to the suffering of others? Or does it close them off, puff them up, shut them down? The test is not verbal. It is existential. He was also aware that religious beliefs often arise where reason falters. In the will to believe, he makes a bold defense of belief without proof. Not belief in spite of reason, but belief where reason is silent. There are certain truths, he argued, that can only become true through our belief in them. A friendship cannot begin unless you believe the other person might care. A moral cause cannot be pursued unless you believe it might succeed. Likewise, faith in a higher order of life cannot be proven in advance. It must be lived into. This is what James called faith in the possibility of the good. It is a moral wager. And like any wager, it involves risk. But it is a risk that, if taken sincerely, can reorder one's world. The person who believes they are not alone, who believes their life has sacred significance, who acts as if their suffering is not meaningless, that person becomes different, not invulnerable, but resilient, not omniscient, but anchored. And this anchoring is not passive. It demands effort. James speaks often of the strenuous life, a life in which belief is not a hiding place, but a source of power, a resource for action. The person who lives with serious belief is not excused from struggle. They are called into it more deeply. Their faith must be proven, not in words, but in daily integrity, in love that costs, in justice that stretches, in hope that survives disappointment. He also reminds us that religious transformation is often invisible. It does not announce itself. It does not demand applause. It unfolds in the quiet decisions, the subtle changes in tone, the way a person begins to speak with more humility or listen with more care. These are the signs of what James called saintliness, not sainthood as perfection, but as orientation. A turning of the whole self toward the good. So the man on the cliff breathes in the storm. He does not have answers, But he has a vow, a direction, a sense that his life is not just something that happens, but something that matters. He will walk back from the edge, not with certainty, but with conviction. Because in the end, James teaches us, belief is not about what we claim. It is about how we live. A woman walks through a crowded street, lost in thought. She hears voices, traffic, music spilling from a nearby cafe. And yet, none of it registers fully. She is elsewhere, returning in memory to a night 10 years ago, when she stood in the dark beside a lake and felt, for the first time, that she was not alone. No one was there. No voice spoke. And yet she felt seen, held real. William James would say that this moment, though long past, still lives in her. It has become part of the architecture of herself. James believed that religious experiences, when genuine, do not fade like dreams. They become enduring points of orientation. They lodge in the consciousness, not as ideas to be recalled, but as atmospheres to be inhabited. A person who has known what he called the reality of the unseen never quite returns to ordinary perception. They may doubt, they may forget, they may grow skeptical, but the memory remains. And it informs how they interpret future events, how they meet suffering, how they love. This is central to James's psychology of religion. He understood that religious belief is not merely a stance, it is a structure of experience. It shapes what one sees, feels, notices. It directs attention toward a moral dimension of life that is otherwise invisible. And in doing so, it alters the self not by imposing doctrine, but by cultivating sensitivity. A person who believes that every human being is sacred begins to see differently. Not because of an argument, but because of a lived conviction. Such conviction, James argued, is not irrational. It is existentially rational. It arises from the total evidence of one's life, not just intellectual, but emotional, moral, experiential. We believe what speaks to our deepest needs. What explains the unexplainable? What gives form to the formless? This does not mean all beliefs are equal, but it does mean that beliefs must be understood in context, in the landscape of the soul, and in that landscape, James identified something essential, the continuity of the self through religious experience. The self, for him, is not a static entity. It is a stream, dynamic, evolving, plural. But within this stream, certain experiences become fixed points. They gather meaning over time. They become what he called centers of gravity. A religious experience, especially one marked by clarity or surrender, often becomes such a center. It is returned to again and again, not always consciously, but as a kind of background presence. A source of strength, of coherence, of moral depth. This depth is not sentimental. It is earned. James made clear that religious insight often comes through suffering, through illness, loss, guilt, fear. It is when the old frameworks collapse that new insight breaks in. The person who stands on the edge of despair and finds something, a light, a word, a silence that holds, emerges changed. They may still suffer, but the suffering now has contour. It is part of a larger shape. It belongs to a narrative that includes redemption, and this narrative is what gives the self a sense of continuity. Not continuity as sameness, but as direction. A self that has suffered, doubted, believed, fallen, and risen again knows itself in a deeper way. It carries its past not as weight, but as resonance. James saw this as the moral power of religious belief. It gives people a story in which their pain is not meaningless, a frame in which their striving makes sense, a field in which their actions matter. But this story must be lived. It must be enacted. James was clear. Religious experience is not self-contained. It demands fruit. A life that claims faith but shows no change is, to him, a contradiction. The person transformed by belief must show it in kindness, in patience, in courage. The internal must shape the external. The sacred must touch the mundane. Otherwise, the belief remains aesthetic, not ethical. So the woman continues through the crowd, remembering that moment by the lake. She is not thinking in doctrine. She is remembering a presence, a feeling of being part of something larger. It does not tell her what to do, but it guides how she listens, how she sees strangers, how she endures disappointment, how she hopes. James would say that this is the real function of religion, not to answer every question, but to make us the kind of beings who can live the questions with seriousness, who can act with integrity despite uncertainty, who can suffer without collapsing, who can love even when love is not returned. And so, religious belief becomes not just an idea in the mind, but a rhythm in the self, a way of being in the world that changes everything. A father rises before dawn. The house is still. He moves through quiet rooms, preparing breakfast, ironing a shirt, reviewing a day already full of burdens. There is no applause, no moment of revelation, just a sense of duty, of rhythm, of quiet intention. But something deeper stirs beneath the surface, a question that shapes his every step. What kind of life am I trying to live? William James would recognize this not as mundane routine but as lived religion. For James, religion is not confined to temples, texts, or rituals. It is most alive in moments of fidelity, when a person returns again and again to an ideal, not because it is easy, but because it matters. Belief, in this light, is not about what we say, it is about how we bear our obligations, how we respond to the world, especially when no one is watching. The Father is not professing faith in words, but in action, in repetition, in care. This is the heart of James's pragmatic approach to religion. He insisted that the value of a religious belief must be tested by its cash value, what it does in practice. Does it shape character? Does it sustain effort? Does it generate moral energy? In this sense, the test of belief is not in metaphysical speculation, but in lived result. A belief that animates sacrifice, that renews resolve, that inspires forgiveness, that belief, whether or not it can be proven, is real in the only way that matters. But James was not a utilitarian. He was not saying that beliefs are good just because they're useful. He was saying that truth must include how beliefs feel and what they do. Religion for him was not a set of propositions, it was a mode of being, a way of inhabiting the world with depth, with earnestness, with moral gravity. And the proof of this mode is in the tone of life it produces. This tone is hard to define, but unmistakable. It is the tone of seriousness, of inner alignment, of steadiness amid contradiction. James believed that the religious person is not immune to pain or confusion, but they carry a certain coherence, a sense that their life, however fragile, is directed, that their actions are anchored in something more than personal whim or social expectation. This anchoring comes not from certainty, but from commitment. James emphasized that the most transformative beliefs are often held in tension with doubt, with ambiguity, with fear. But the believer does not wait for all doubts to vanish. They act. They live as if their values are true. And in that act, the values become real. James called this faith working by love. It is not belief in the abstract. It is belief made flesh. Such belief does not always feel inspiring. Often, it feels like repetition, like work, like the Father's quiet routines. But James saw that these small, steady acts are the true measure of belief. The person who chooses compassion on a hard day, who returns to a promise when no one else remembers it, who continues to hope despite loss, that person is living a kind of sacrament, not outwardly, but inwardly. And the world is changed by it. James also understood that this kind of belief is fragile. It must be renewed. It must be supported by community, by memory, by moments of renewal. He wrote that religious life is often cyclical, a rhythm of dryness and grace, of despair and restoration. This rhythm is not a failure of faith. It is. It's human shape. We forget, we return, we lose heart. We are lifted. And in that cycle, the self is formed not once, but continually. And here is perhaps James's most radical insight. Even if religious belief is never proven true in the traditional sense, it may still be the most real thing about a person, because it shows up where everything else falls away. It shows up in sacrifice and endurance, in the refusal to betray the good. It shows up in the Father waking before dawn not with joy, but with purpose. So religion, for James, is not a doctrine we recite. It is a direction we live. It is not a system we defend. It is a seriousness we embody. And that seriousness, lived quietly, can be the moral center of a world. She stands in front of the mirror, adjusting her scarf before a difficult conversation. Her stomach knots. Her voice feels distant. But she has made the decision. She will not lie. She will not avoid. She will speak the truth. Not because it is easy, but because it is the right thing to do. There is no halo, no divine whisper, just a deep sense of necessity. William James would call this a moral moment, a point where belief becomes behavior, where spirituality becomes character. For James, religious belief is never merely internal. It must manifest, not in spectacle, but in seriousness. The person who believes in a deeper order of life, who senses the universe as morally structured, must live differently. Their decisions, however ordinary, are framed by something more. They feel the weight of consequence. Not just practical consequence, but moral consequence. What kind of person am I becoming by doing this? This, for James, is the real test of religion. He understood that the most profound religious transformations are ethical at their core. A person who has had a genuine religious experience begins to live with a new sense of responsibility. They become aware not only of their own actions, but of their inner life. Thoughts matter. Words matter. Attention matters. The spiritual life, in James's view, is not defined by ritual, but by moral seriousness. By the refusal to live on the surface. This seriousness is not gloom, it is presence. A kind of spiritual intensity that gives ordinary life a depth charge. James saw this in the lives of saints, not because they were perfect, but because they were radically available. Available to truth, to others, to suffering, to joy. They were not armored. They were open. And this openness was not passivity. It was a kind of inner resolve, a fidelity to the good even when it was costly. This cost is crucial. James wrote that religious experience is often accompanied by a sense of sacrifice, not martyrdom, but voluntary self-giving. The person who believes deeply is often called to relinquish something: pride, vengeance, ease. And in that relinquishment, they are not diminished. They are clarified. Something in them sharpens. The self becomes more coherent, more real. And this clarity spills over. James noted that the truly religious person exerts a kind of gravitational pull, not through charisma, but through integrity. Their presence affects others. It calms, it challenges, it awakens. This is not mystical. It is moral psychology. A person who lives from the depth of their conviction creates space for others to examine their own. They become, in James's phrase, a center of spiritual energy. This energy is not about being spiritual in a cultural sense. It is about living as if life is sacred, as if every moment contains an opportunity to act with love, with truth, with courage. James did not claim this was easy. He knew the inner life is complex, that we are often divided. That belief waxes and wanes. But he also knew that when we choose to live from our higher self, even briefly, something changes. Not just in us, but around us. The woman walks into the room. She speaks. Her voice is steady, her eyes clear. The conversation does not go perfectly, but something important happens. She remains whole. She does not betray herself. She does not shrink. And in doing so, she affirms not a doctrine, but a way of being. A spiritual truth embodied. James would say this is what religion at its best does. It enables us to live with coherence, with alignment, with a sense that our lives, though uncertain, are oriented towards something worth sacrificing for. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. This reverence does not depend on dogma. It depends on attention, on awareness, on choosing to see life, not as random, but as charged with moral significance. And this choice must be made daily. It is never automatic. It is always a form of work, but it is work that transforms. Because in the act of living seriously, the self becomes substantial. The inner life gains gravity. And that gravity becomes a force in the world. He lights a candle in a dark room. Not out of tradition, not because someone told him to, but because the act itself feels necessary. A way to mark a passage, to name a loss, to make visible something invisible. He sits beside the flame in silence, watching the flicker, letting the shadows move. He does not pray, not exactly. But something in him feels answered. William James would say this is the essence of religious life. Not answers, but orientation. Not doctrine, but depth. A seriousness that meets existence on its own terms. James's philosophy culminates not in a system, but in a sensibility. A way of being in the world that honors the fragility of life without surrendering to despair. He believed that religion, at its core, is about responding to the moral structure of reality. Not inventing it, not escaping it, but aligning with it, living as if goodness matters, as if beauty heals, as if the soul is real, not because we can prove it, but because we live better when we believe it. He did not ask us to be certain. He asked us to be sincere, to risk belief, to test its fruits, to let the unseen become visible in our actions. He called on us to treat our interior life as a frontier, not a refuge. A place where the self is not protected, but exposed. Not perfected, but engaged. This engagement is not heroic. It is humble. It is the Father rising before dawn. The woman speaking truth in love. The young man in the clearing. The mother by the crib. The person lighting a candle in the dark. These are the saints of James's universe, not because they are flawless, but because they are serious. Because they choose to live as if life matters, even when the world offers no guarantee. This is the will to believe. Not as ideology, but as courage, as hope, as the refusal to collapse. So now we turn to you. What do you believe in when no one is watching? What kind of self are you building through your quiet choices? If this video illuminated even a corner of your inner life, consider liking it, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with 3 friends who are ready to take their experience seriously.